let's do a walkthrough of the skull while my dog scratches himself to death. Hopefully you can hear his tags jingling. Oh, of course, now he stops. Anywho, I put this skull up on a cup of M&Ms, no less, just to make it a little easier for you to see the occipital bone. The occipital bone, okay? And a bone is considered an organ. It's also a type of tissue, unfortunately, because English is stupid, but the occipital bone is one of the cranial bones, okay? Here, left and right parietal bones. We have one occipital bone, but two parietal bones. Where occipital meets parietal, that joint, which is called a suture, that specific suture is called the lambdoid suture. I'm going to take this off the cup. Plus, that way I get to eat M&Ms. Okay. Left parietal, right parietal, and the part in the back is occipital. Whereas here, frontal bone, and the suture between frontal bone and parietal bones, the two parietal bones, is the coronal suture, corona, okay? Here, very laterally positioned, right temporal bone, that includes this arm here, okay? And on the other side, here, including this arm, left temporal bone. The suture between temporal bone and corresponding parietal bone, squamous suture. Squamous means flat. Squamous suture. There are some other sutures that we need to know along the way, but I won't hold you responsible for every suture of the skull. If a bone, skull bone, is in contact more or less with the brain, then it's called a cranial bone. Whereas if it's in the head but not in direct contact with the brain, it's called a facial bone. But collectively, we can describe them all by saying skull bones. Okay? Now, the different bones of the skull have different bone markings. A bone marking is simply a feature of a bone. Kind of like a button would be a feature of a shirt, okay? Or a pocket would be a feature of a shirt, all right? Or my knee would be a feature of my leg, that sort of idea, okay? There are two bones here, very small and very long, proportionately, called, not surprisingly, nasal bones. And then there's a bone here. And here, paired, in other words, lacrimal bones. Okay. Through the orbit, I can see part here and here of the sphenoid bone. I can also see here, making up that medial wall of the orbit, and here, other orbit, ethmoid bone, okay? There's a bone here that's making up a good chunk of this arch that you and I have been calling cheekbone, right? This bone is the zygomatic bone. Here's the other, the right zygomatic bone, okay? Here and here are the two maxillary bones, or maxillae. Or maxillary bones, either is fine. This guy, aka that guy, mandible. When we are in utero, the mandible starts as two bones that fuse together. And when they fuse together, They fuse together right along that midline. Right along that midline, which does form a bone marking that we'll talk about shortly. Hold on, my kid needs help. Do you need help? Hey, bud. Can you help? Are you okay?
You need help on this.
Okay.
It's always with these bars.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Wait, do you freeze these?
I can't actually freeze. Oh, these?
Yeah.
No. I thought you were asking if I froze my video, and I can't actually freeze my video. So now you're on YouTube for the rest of your life. Yay! Okay, let's see. What did I not point out yet? Bone-wise. I'm going to point these out, but I'll also go over them again later because they are tough. There's a little shelf right here inside the nasal cavity. And here, paired, in other words, inferior nasal conchae, plural, or each one is an inferior nasal concha, singular. Okay, and then we really can't see the vomer from this aspect, and that means that this image in your practicum study guide is actually misleading. You can't see that much of the vomer from the anterior view. That's malarkey. Okay, let's talk about bone markings. This portion of the frontal bone, fairly flat, therefore not surprisingly called the squamous portion or the squamous part of the frontal bone. Right here where you would frown, that bone marking of the frontal bone is called the glabella. Glabella. Okay. This teeny tiny passageway here and here is sometimes expressed as a notch, sometimes expressed as more of a hole, like a passageway. It's called the supra, meaning superior, orbital, oh, superior to the orbit, I get it. Supraorbital foramen. Since we have two, we have supraorbital foramina. Foramina is the plural of foramen. And foramen is just hole or passageway, though there are other words for holes and passageways. Yay! Okay, this edge here, supraorbital margin, that's probably fairly intuitive. Okay. I'm not sure if you can see this at this angle very well. Also, I'll tilt the skull a little bit. That slit right there, deep in the orbit, superior orbital fissure. Whereas this slit here, inferior orbital fissure. Okay, there's a hole. There's a hole. See that passageway? Oh, wow, I just about lost my probe there. In the back of the orbit, optic canal. Optic canal. And we'll find out soon enough that it's actually a bone marking of the sphenoid bone. Here, this is the nasal septum, or at least the bone reinforcing the nasal septum, right along that center line of the nasal cavity, okay? Well, the nasal septum is made out of two bones. Two bones. The ethmoid bone, specifically the perpendicular plate, which is a bone marking of the ethmoid bone, and another bone called the vomer, and I'll show you how those meet together later, I promise. Here, these two shelves, they're superior to the shelves I pointed out earlier, the superior nasal conchae. These are not surprisingly called middle nasal conchae. However, they're not separate bones. They're bone markings of the ethmoid. Inferior nasal conchae are separate bones, and I'll cover that again because I know it's confusing. Don't worry, I will cover that again. here, the kind of subtle ridge that forms as a result of the fusion of the two bones coming together to form one mandible. This is the mandibular symphysis. Mandibular symphysis. And these, boop, boop, mental foramina, or each one would be a mental foramen. Okay. Here, at this angle, you can better see this. There's a passageway. There's a passageway. Not surprisingly, infraorbital, inferior to the orbit. Infraorbital foramina, or each one would be an infraorbital foramen. Okay, baby steps. Baby steps. Okay, we're going to take this skull cap off. Well, I'm going to try. Good grief. The angle's horrible because I have to wrap my arms around the camera. Wow, lots going on in there. Lots. Here's the inside of the skull, the portion that's actually in contact with cerebrum. Okay. And I kind of see bowls or basins in a really nice waterfall. So if I were to pour water, I don't know if this is going to help, but we'll get those M&Ms back out. I'm okay with that. If I were to pour water in here quickly, and a lot of it, much of that would flow into this basin, and then much of that would flow into this basin. It's kind of like 3 steps, okay? And those basins are called the anterior cranial fossae, would be plural. Each one is an anterior cranial fossa. Middle cranial fossae, each is a fossa. And posterior cranial fossae, or fossa. Okay, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Left and right. Here, this protrusion that I think looks a heck of a lot like a shark fin in this model. Okay, that's called the crista galli. Crista galli. And it's sticking out at you through a perforated plate. And that perforated plate is the cribriform plate. All of these little perforations, all of these little holes in the cribriform plate are called cribriform foramina. Cribriform foramina. And I will go over those again because I know ethmoid is just really, really tough. The sphenoid bone, which I also will cover again later, looks, when we isolate it, quite a bit like, I don't know, a Dr. Seuss or a Tim Burton bat, okay? Or maybe a butterfly, and therefore has 4 wings. That's a wing. Oh, my hand's probably right in your way. That's a wing, sorry. Not left-handed. There's a wing. There's a much bigger wing. There's the other much bigger wing, okay? These two are called lesser wings, and these two are called greater wings. And I'll get those stuck in your head much better later. These 2 holes, 1 and 2, those are the optic canals that we saw from the front view. So if we magic school bus our way through the orbit, we're going to end up inside the skull, and it turns out that optic canals are therefore bone markings of the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone. Here is a little saddle, and we'll come back to this again later. I'll get it stuck in your head again later, okay? The entire seat, the entire saddle, the entire chair, if that's better for you, is called the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle, all right? Whereas right here, just the base, right here, just the base, is called the hypophyseal fossa. Hypophyseal fossa. We only have one. And hypophyseal fossa may be easier for you to remember if you know that the pituitary gland is also called, or also known as, the hypophysis. So what do you think sits in this saddle? Yeah, the pituitary gland. So that might help. But again, we'll come back to sphenoid and ethmoid because they're tough. They're tough. The sphenoid has the most bone markings of all skull bones. So that's why it's a beast. Beastly. All right. Now, do you guys see at this angle? Sorry, this light is not fantastic. Home is a compromise, right? 1, 2, 3 passageways. And a little bit better on this side. 1, 2, 3 passageways. Tiny, big, tiny. Tiny, big, tiny. Okay. Those are foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. Foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and that one's really cooperating and looking oval shaped. Foramen spinosum. And I can remember those, which is which, correctly every time without studying because I have a mnemonic. Look, 2 rows, 1, 2, right? These holes, these passageways align in a row. So what I do is I misspell the word rose, R-O-S, rotundum, ovale, spinosum, rose. Okay. This passageway here, I'm going to try to rest my, there we go, probe there. Passageway, which is really formed when temporal bones, occipital bone, and sphenoid bone meet, is called foramen lacerum, and it's spelled lacerum. Lacerum. And the mnemonic for that is, if you give somebody enough rum, maybe they'll show you their lace. It's horrible, I know. Okay. This, believe it or not, looks so different from this. Right? That's temporal bone. We think of it as very, very flat. Whereas on the inside, it's got this really kind of rocky protrusion. There's the flat part. There's the really rocky inward protrusion. And that rocky inward protrusion is called the petrous part, or the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Okay? And that's actually where the labyrinth of bone that helps function in some of your special senses is housed. Okay, that's housing for both your some of your hearing apparatus and your equilibrium apparatus. Okay, let's see, what else can we do? We can do these guys. Also very, very large passageways. 2 of them, left and right. Okay, this is the left jugular foramen. This is the right jugular foramen. We have 2 jugular foramina. Okay. This wee hole here I did not assign, so don't worry about it. Here, foramen magnum. Foramen magnum. One of the largest foramina in your body. All right. It allows the passage of your brainstem and therefore communicate, a bridge between brain and spinal cord. Let's see. Did I miss any? Yes, I did. Okay. For these, we're going to turn a little bit. And that way we can get actually some other stuff too. Here. Internal acoustic meatus. Okay, I'm going to turn the other way. Oh, there's the other internal acoustic meatus. Okay. Also, while we're turned, oh, there's a little passageway there. While we're turned, oh, there's a little passageway there. Hypoglossal canal. Not to be confused with hypophyseal fossa. Isn't that horrible? Okay, did I get them all? I'm trying to go in the same order as your practicum study guide. I trust you are following along with that. Otherwise, how are you going to spell all this stuff? My God. Okay, let's see what else we can do using this skull. Oh, I forgot to show you this suture. Doi. It is just too easy. The suture joint between the two parietal bones is called the sagittal suture. Sagittal suture, lambdoid, coronal. Okay. All right, let's get our M&Ms back out. Actually, I don't think that's going to help us much. We're going to have to do one of these. I hope you can see. All right. There's this little boop right here. You see that sticking out? Boop. It looks like, whoops, the world's worst ponytail. That's the external occipital protuberance. External occipital protuberance. Okay. And it aligns with a really subtle ridge here, where my pointer is tracing, right here. Okay, really, really subtle ridge that's called the external occipital crest. External occipital crest. It aligns this way with a ridge, perpendicular, okay, that's called the superior nuchal line, okay, and then here, very, very subtle, is a ridge called the inferior nuchal line. Really difficult to see, but all together it makes a grid. I've got a cell or a square here, a cell or a square here, a cell or a square here, a cell or a square there. And just in case, you can really see that here. See the grid? 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cell. Okay. Let's see. Other stuff we can see from this view while we're here. That lump, really, really, really pronounced, and that lump, really, really, really pronounced. Mastoid processes. Each one is a mastoid process. Excuse me. Those are our bone markings of the temporal bones. Okay. Also bone markings of the temporal bones, these guys that almost look like my probe. Right? They're really, really pointy. They're called styloid processes. Kind of nice. Makes sense. Okay. And then the only other thing that I'm going to point out right now in this view is that the joint between occipital bone and temporal bone, here, and here is called the occipitomastoid. Oh, that makes sense. Suture. Occipitomastoid suture. Okay? Hopefully that feels all right. Okay, let's work on the lateral view. A lot of this will just be repeat, which is lovely. Frontal bone, right parietal bone, occipital bone, right temporal bone, right zygomatic bone, right maxilla or maxillary bone, I don't care, right lacrimal bone, right nasal bone. And I think from this view you can really better see the nasal bone. Okay, mandible. Okay, and then this little peekaboo here, that's sphenoid bone, yet again. Sphenoid bone. And right there, where my probe is kind of disappearing out of sight, that's ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone, a little peekaboo of the ethmoid bone. And I'll go over that again. I promise. I promise. Let's angle this up a little bit. In fact, maybe this will help. Yeah, I think that'll work. All right, this passageway here, external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus. Okay. This arm is the devil. Okay, because this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And this wee arm here, it's the devil because it's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. In other words, if you and I were reaching toward each other, okay, my arm, and your name is Fred, of course, my arm would be the Fred process of the Tessa bone, and your arm would be the Tessa process of the Fred bone. Isn't that crazy? Together, they make up this bridge, this arch, that's called the zygomatic arch. Okay? Zygomatic process, temporal process, together make up zygomatic arch. Let's see, what else can we do? There's our mastoid process again. There's our styloid process again. Right side, of course. Okay, and now we can see the mandible a little bit better. I also like to isolate it. I think that helps especially. Okay, this portion that's really resting in a fossa of the temporal bone, it's called the condylar process of the mandible. Okay, this portion here, this is called the coronoid process, and what might help is that it's more or less pointing at the coronal suture. Coronoid, coronal suture. Not my mnemonic. A student came up with that one. Because students are brilliant. They really are. And then here, this notch between condylar process and coronoid process is called the mandibular notch. Easy peasy. This portion that I'm pinching, that's the ramus or the mandibular ramus. Okay. Here, right there, mandibular angle, and then again, mental foramen. Mental foramen. And by the way, the portion of the sphenoid bone that's peekabooing at you is the greater wing. That's the portion that you're seeing. There's the squamous suture again. I can kind of see a little bit of the lambdoid suture. Can make out the occipitomastoid suture. Is there anything else we can point out here easily? If we turn this a little bit, maybe a lot, you can at least infer infraorbital foramen, supraorbital foramen. Okay. Okay, let's do this view. Maybe. Oh, nice. Okay. Nice. Maybe put you guys up on my. Maybe? Is that gonna work? Yeah. Ish. It's all about the ish. Okay. Can I reach though? Debatable. All right. The hard portion at the roof of your mouth, the portion that lets you do this. Okay. That's your hard palate. And your hard palate is actually reinforced by 4 bones. Your right and left maxillae, your right and left palatine bones. Okay. And this portion of the maxillae is called the palatine process. This portion of the palatine bone is called the horizontal plate. Okay. Also from this view, we can see another bone that we haven't seen before here. This is the posterior-most aspect of the vomer. But I will go over vomer again. It's a tough one. What else can we see from here? If I dislocate the jaw, sorry, this might creep you out. Now we can better see zygomatic arch. Okay. Here, this passageway, and here, this passageway, foramen lacerum. Okay. Here, this is foramen ovale. And here's the left foramen ovale, which does not want to take my probe quite as easily. Okay. Right foramen spinosum. Left, let me get my fingers out of the way. Left foramen spinosum. And you might be wondering, wait, where did rotundum go? Rotundum actually turns a corner. So let's get that skull cap out of our way again. Oh, actually, this particular skull doesn't allow me to go through. But if it did, my probe would be coming out at an angle that you wouldn't be able to see. In this view. Oh boy. Is this gonna go terribly wrong? Probably. Don't you hate it when your mandible does that? Okay. What else can we see? Here, this passageway. And here, this passageway. Okay, and this passageway turns a corner, so I'm not going to see it, my probe go all the way through, okay? Carotid canal. Whereas here, quite large. Let me angle that a little bit more for you. And kind of jelly bean shaped. I almost see the letter J, like a really puffy letter J. Jugular foramen, or because we have 2, jugular foramina. Okay. There's foramen magnum again. Okay. These guys we did not assign, right? But hopefully you can infer, even though you're not looking at the passageway right now, you're just looking at my probe going through, penetrating that passageway. What is that one called? Yeah, that's the hypoglossal canal. Hypoglossal canal. Here, where the coronoid process of the mandible rests, this is the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Okay, styloid processes are coming out at you. Mastoid processes are coming out at you. Gosh, sorry. Petrous portion of the temporal bone. Petrous portion of the temporal bone. Let's see. Way down here. In fact, you can't even see it. I don't think I can. There we go. Now you can hopefully see the external occipital protuberance. Okay, and here, whoops, I need more hands. That is faux show. Inferior nuchal line. Okay, I'm just looking to see if there's anything else I can point out. One other biggie. These two, really smooth. They kind of look like rocking horse legs, the underside of a rocking horse leg, for good reason. These allow you to nod your head. You're rocking your head, really on your superiormost vertebra. Okay, these are called occipital condyles. Occipital condyles. Here, let me get my pointer out. Fingers are too thick. Here. That's sphenoid bone. Just from another view, sphenoid bone. Okay. And is there anything else we can do right now? Oh, I might as well do these now. But I'll come back to them too. These extensions from the sphenoid bone, here and here, these are called the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid bone. I'll come back to them. What are we going to do next? Okay, I think, I'm just double checking. I think we're ready to make a mess. I know your body already feels like a mess, or at least your brain does. The only other thing I want to do before I put this particular skull away is I want to talk about how frustrated I am with only having two hands. Come on, buddy. Cooperate. It says no. I will not. Ish. Is that we do need to know the layout of the orbit. And the different bones that contribute to it. There are 7 bones that contribute to your orbit. Frontal bone, ethmoid bone, lacrimal bone, maxillary bone, zygomatic bone, sphenoid bone makes up that lateral wall, and then you really can't see it in the model, but it is shown on your practicum study guide. Just a peekaboo of the palatine bone. And that peekaboo is so small, it's maybe the size of that eraser. Really tiny. Palatine bone. And just in case, this is the image in your study guide where you can a little more clearly see, just because it's color coded. Oh yeah, there is a little teeny tiny peekaboo of the palatine bone. And by the way, in your study guide, especially those early slides that are so crowded with labels. Let me see if I can find one. Yeah, that'll do. The bones are in bold and the bone markings are not. So when you look at this slide and you're overwhelmed by it, because who would not be, do the bold first, then go back through and do the bone markings. Okay? Because, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot. I'm just double checking. Yeah, we're ready. Okay, now we're going to make a mess. So I'm going to put this skull away and I'm going to get out another skull that's already just a horrible mess. You're like, yay, bring it on. All right, I have a disarticulated skull that I have, oh God, it's so gonna fall apart. Gingerly taped together. And when it's taped together like that, it looks like another species of human skull. Doesn't quite look like Homo sapiens. Okay, and what's really nice about having a disarticulated skull, model, of course, you don't want one in your head, okay, is that, yeah, we can point out all our bones, but then we can take it apart and see each bone individually, which is just lovely. The bad news is that as soon as I take probably any of this tape off, the entire model will fall apart, so it will lose its shape, and that's why I'm showing you what it looks like or looked like when it was taped together. Parietal, frontal, temporal, zygomatic. The nasal bones are pretty well covered up by that tape. Lacrimal bone. There's a peekaboo of ethmoid. There's a peekaboo of sphenoid. There's maxilla. We actually were looking at the mandible earlier. Oh, by the way, there is another bone marking of the mandible that we need to know. It's here and here. Right and left mandibular foramina, actually, because it's plural. So that's kind of evil that these are called mandibular foramina, but these are called mental foramina. Rude. Anyway, that's removed from this skull, okay? And then I did not include the vomer. There's the vomer isolated, okay, on purpose, because I'm going to use it later. And I did not include the inferior nasal conchae on purpose, because I'm going to include those later, or involve those later, okay? I can barely, I don't know, it might fall apart. Look into the nasal cavity here and see some of what I'm supposed to see, but I will walk you through that quite carefully, okay? And now we should take this apart. Let's make a mess. Let's start here and see what happens. Okay, what I've removed are the two nasal bones, left and right. They are not big. No. Nasal bones, okay? And then hanging on by a thread of tape, where did I put my other forceps? I got them out just for this and then hid them from myself because, you know, super smart. Where did I, seriously? Oh, they're right at my elbow. Hanging on by just a little thread of tape. Lacrimal bone. There's the right one. Okay. They're very similar in size and shape to the nasal bones. They're just different in location. Actually they're actually in the orbit. Let's see if I can pick this up without it falling apart. There's the other lacrimal bone. The left. Okay. Let's see, what damage should we do next? At this point, I do not think it matters. It's going to be a horrible mess no matter what, right? Okay, get ready for noise. Wow, that's really taped on there. Which is so funny because when I was actually taping these, they were like, no, I will not. You cannot make me. Okay, that's the hard palate. Okay, and I have taped together the maxillary bones, right and left, and the two palatine bones, right and left, okay? And we can see now, oh yeah, there are these sort of like arms to the palatine bones that do reach up and peekaboo into the orbits. That's where that little peekaboo comes from, okay? And then still magically, thankfully, taped in place are the zygomatic bones. Zygomatic bone, zygomatic bone, okay? So let's take some of that tape off. And here I had the zygomatic process, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone taped together. A little too well. Okay, there we go. All right, and I'm going to untape that zygomatic bone. Oh, barkiness. So there's the right zygomatic bone. By the end of the quarter, everybody knows my dog's names because they hear me yelling at them all the time. Ruby is the bigger dog, and Hercules is the smaller, and so Hercules is the one that's barking right now. There's the left zygomatic bone. Okay. And then I really did a number of tape jobs here on maxillae, two right and left maxillary bones. Again, their palatine processes come together to make the anterior of the hard palate. Okay, whereas still taped together, two oh yeah, 1, 2. They were taped together so well they look like one. Right and left palatine bones, okay? And here are their horizontal plates coming together to make the posterior, which was oriented like this when we, I think, last looked at it. The posterior of the hard palate, okay? Palatine bones. And it's these arms that are coming up and peekabooing into the orbits. Okay. Now, let's see if this will hold on. I'm really shocked. This is the most buried bone in your skull. And therefore, arguably, the hardest to understand. This is your ethmoid. Your ethmoid. And it's the ethmoid and the sphenoid that are probably the most difficult to oh, I have a pun, wrap your head around, because they're so buried. So that's why it's really nice to have a disarticulated skull that we can pull apart and really isolate those bones, okay? Here's frontal bone, ethmoid bone. This guy is sphenoid. There's temporal. The styloid process of this temporal bone broke off, but it was right there, still intact there. Occipital bone. Okay, so we don't have too many bones left to look at. Must protect everyone in neighborhood from evil. Bark, bark. All right, there's the left temporal bone. Looks so smooth in the lateral view, but in the medial view, oh my God, what a mess. There's that petrous portion. It's a lot easier to see when it's isolated. Okay, and now you can better appreciate, oh, external acoustic meatus and internal acoustic meatus really run through that petrous portion. Right. Okay, let's remove the right side. I mean, I know this is just going to jinx everything, but I am absolutely stunned that this has not fallen completely apart. It was such a devil to tape together. Just a devil. Like, I started wondering, is this worth it? I'm going to pretend it is. There's the right temporal bone, external acoustic meatus, internal acoustic meatus, right? Petrous portion versus squamous portion. Okay. Right parietal bone. Left parietal bone. Okay. And they were articulated like that. Okay. Clang, clang. There's our occipital bone. It actually does look quite distinct once you isolate it, because the foramen magnum is a bone marking of the occipital bone. So that becomes really, really clear. There are the occipital condyles. Okay. And this model doesn't clearly show the hypoglossal canal, but it would be here, here, poking through that occipital condyle. Okay. There's our external occipital protuberance. There's our superior nuchal line or inferior nuchal line in our external occipital crest. God, I can't believe that ethmoid is still in place. I'm so impressed. Frontal bone, ethmoid bone, right? And now that we've isolated the frontal bone, you can really see, oh yeah, that ceiling of the orbit is comprised of frontal bone, okay? And the medial wall of the orbit is comprised of ethmoid. Okay. This guy, right? Tim Burton or Dr. Seuss made a bat. Do you see it now? Or a weird butterfly. I totally see it. That's the sphenoid bone. Okay. Right lesser wing, left lesser wing, right greater wing, left greater wing. Okay. Oh good, it does go through. I was worried it didn't go through in this model. Here. And here. Occipital canals. Right and left. Okay. Here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 in a row. Foramen rotundum. Ah, this is better. So notice that when I put my probe through, I actually get projected forward rather than down, anteriorly rather than inferiorly. Okay. Foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, and I don't like them as much on this side, so that's why I'm pointing them out on this side of this model, okay? And then here, I don't know if that angle works for you, here, the entire chair, Sella turcica, but right here, just at the base, hypophyseal fossa. And here's how I remember a lot of this stuff. Oh, plus these sort of hangy bits, pterygoid processes. I imagine, since this is a Dr. Seuss or a Tim Burton, I don't like that these are asymmetric, bat or moth or bird or whatever, okay? I imagine that there's a fairy, okay? And the fairy sits in the saddle. She grips the lesser wing in order to steer, okay? She fires lasers using the optic canal. Those are her sights. Get it? Sight. Okay? And look, there are even stirrups for her legs. Okay? And because there's a fairy sitting in the saddle, I can very easily describe where the hypophyseal fossa is. The whole saddle is a Sella turcica, but the part of the saddle where the fairy farts, that's right, fairy farts, is the hypophyseal fossa. A little bit better, maybe. I'm hoping. Yes, sirree. Okay, I want to show you something in just a hot second. Too much stuff. Here, by the way, and here. Okay. Those that I just pointed out are the superior orbital fissures. So the superior orbital fissures are bone markings of the sphenoid, okay? Whereas, if I put my probe through the lesser orbital fissure, oh, look at where it emerges. It doesn't emerge inside the cranium. That's because it's not a bone marking of one bone. It's where sphenoid and maxillae don't quite fuse together. Okay, anyway. Sphenoid bone, Tim Burton, Dr. Seuss. Pretty cool. I love it. Okay. Let's disarticulate. Ethmoid from frontal. Okay, but this is how they were sitting together. Okay. The ethmoid is really hard to cast, so it's actually bigger than this, more involved than this. Okay, but we can get a lot of stuff done with this little nugget. Here, the part that I'm pinching, that's the perpendicular plate. Perpendicular plate. Here, that is the medial wall of the orbit. Ah, there's the medial wall of the other orbit, the left orbit. Okay. Here, that's middle nasal concha. Here, well, actually, here, that's the other middle nasal concha. Now, you may have already guessed that if we have an inferior nasal concha, a middle nasal concha, then we better also have a superior nasal concha. However, it's buried in our nasal cavity, and I'll walk you through that in just a moment, I promise. Okay, this is the anterior view, by the way, of the ethmoid. Right view. posterior view, left view, inferior view, superior view. And do you see that shark fin coming out at you? That's Christogali, okay? And the sort of platform from which it arises, cribriform plate, all the little holes in the cribriform plate are called cribriform foramina. Okay, now we're going to switch to a different model. A very, 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 very simplified model. Therefore, it is not to scale. Bless you. Not to be taken. Sorry, my son sneezed. You probably didn't even hear it. Too literally. Uh-oh. I need one more. There we go. Okay. That's right. It's made out of cereal boxes and duct tape. Okay. Imagine that this box is our nasal cavity. Okay. So not the right scale or the right shape, or just let it go. All right. Most of this box is ethmoid bone. The roof of the box is ethmoid bone. Most of these walls here are ethmoid bone, whereas this floor maybe represents hard palate. Okay. And then if you look into the nasal cavity, do you see that wall that's coming down? That's the perpendicular plate. I colored it blue. The perpendicular plate is a bone marking of the ethmoid bone. Okay. These two, 1, 2, those are the middle nasal conchae. Whereas these two, much smaller, a little more medial in origin, and definitely more superior in location, are, not surprisingly, the superior nasal conchae. If we look above the box, this shark fin is Christogali. Okay. The platform from which Christogali arises is the cribriform plate, and all these little dots that I made, those represent cribriform foramina. Okay. Those are actually passageways, and they would permeate this wall if I was being super thorough. Here, this plain yellow represents the medial wall of the orbit. There's the left medial wall of the orbit. My B washi tape represents palatine processes of maxillary bones, and my strawberry washi tape represents horizontal plates of palatine bones. Okay. Now notice that I did not include in here inferior nasal concha. That's because I was hoping my fingers would help us out. We'll see if this works. So far the answer is no. It does not work out at all. Come on, buddy. Okay, the reason why I didn't include, like, in the form of duct tape, inferior nasal conchae is that I really, really, really wanted to drive home that the inferior nasal conchae are separate bones. We have 6 total nasal conchae. Left and right inferior nasal conchae. Left and right middle nasal conchae. Left and right superior nasal conchae. However, only the inferior nasal conchae are separate bones. Okay. The middle and superior nasal conchae are bone markings of the ethmoid bone. Isn't that crazy? Okay, it gets crazier. Here, this wall, yeah, the way that we're looking at it, it looks like it's made entirely of ethmoid bone. But in reality, I'm going to turn that to its side. Anterior that way. Okay. Our nasal septum is a wall comprised of 2 bricks. This brick is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, but this brick is the very triangular, right? Very triangular vomer, which is a separate bone. Okay, if we're looking at the nasal septum from the anterior view, then all we see is the blue stuff. Whereas if we're looking at the posterior view, then all we see is the white stuff. Okay? But really, we need both bricks to make the complete wall. So if we go back to my horrible cardboard model, then this might represent the vomer. Now I have a complete wall inside, but yeah, from the anterior, very, very, very little of that wall seems to be comprised of vomer. And from the posterior, almost all of that wall seems to be comprised of vomer. Really, there are 2 bricks making 1 wall. Okay, and that's why I left vomer out of my model, because I wanted you to see it articulate with that perpendicular plate. Okay, I hope that helps. That's the skull.